We'll call business, commerce, and tourism to order. Little housekeeping. This is being simulcast, so any speakers, please use the mic. When you're done with the mic, unless you're at the podium, please turn your mic back off. If you have cell phones, please put those on silent. Today we will be presenting the interim study by Senator Hicks on what is preventing Oklahomans from returning to the workforce after the pandemic. With that, I will turn it over to Senator Hicks to give opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, thank you for joining us today, and special guests, I appreciate your time and attention to this very important topic. This study was really kind of born out of multiple frustrations that I heard from my constituents about caring for a loved one with an autoimmune disorder and being afraid to return to the workforce, from business owners who are struggling to hire at capacity to be able to make ends meet, and also for mothers who have unstable childcare and are desperate to be able to pay the bills and put food on the table. And so as we go through today's interim study, I've invited several important speakers that kind of represent those multiple facets that we feel like kind of compound the issue of getting folks back to work in a safe environment. So we'll be hearing from economists at OK Policy, childcare specialists from Oklahoma Childcare Resource and Referral, from the Black Oklahoma City Chamber, and also from the Greater Oklahoma City Chamber as well, to make sure that businesses have a voice in the conversation. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our very first speakers. Josie Phillips is a policy intern. Josie graduated from the University of Oklahoma in spring 2020 with a double major in economics and international and area studies and a minor in Spanish. Previously, she's volunteered through the Women's Resource Center and worked as a tutor and campaign manager. She joined as a policy intern the summer of 2020 and is a 2018 alumna of OK Policy's Summer Policy Institute. Additionally, Paul Shin is a budget and tax senior policy analyst with OK Policy. Shin has held budget and finance positions for the Oklahoma House of Representatives, the Department of Human Services, the cities of Oklahoma City and Del City, and served local governments in his native Oregon. He's also taught political science and public administration at the University of Oklahoma, University of Central Oklahoma, and California State University, Stanislaus. While the Government Finance Officers Association, Paul worked on consulting and research projects for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Transportation, and several state agencies. Needless to say, both of our first presenters are very well versed in making sure that individuals have everything they need in order to get back to work. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speakers.
Members, questions will go through the chair. Ms. Phillips,
yes.
This will be live, so make sure we've got you close enough to the mic while you're presenting.
Okay.
Thank you for being here.
Perfect. Okay, can you hear me okay? Awesome. Well, good morning, everyone, and I would like to start with a special thank you to Senator Leewright and the rest of the committee members for joining us today, as well as Senator Hicks for inviting me to speak here. My name is Josie Phillips, and I am a policy fellow at the Oklahoma Policy Institute, focusing on labor and the economy, and I'm joined by my colleague Paul Shin, who is our senior budget and tax analyst. Oklahoma Policy Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that is focused on advocating for solutions that will help all Oklahomans thrive. And today, we are helping all Oklahomans thrive by talking about how we can get them back into the workforce and which barriers exist to them returning back to work. So, before we dive into that, though, a brief roadmap of what we'll be talking about today. I want to start off with some historical background as to what our labor force was looking like before the pandemic, how it was impacted by the pandemic initially, and then where we are now that we're 18 months in. After that, I want to get into kind of the meat and potatoes of our presentation, which is why aren't people going back to work? And there are four main theories that people often float when discussing this question. So we want to give all of them a fair shake and then wrap it up with a conclusion. And as we discuss each of those theories, we want to present a few core questions that we think are very important to understanding the discussion surrounding these theories. The questions we want to answer are, what is the theory? What is the evidence in favor and against? Assuming that the theory is correct, how do we address it? And what if we address it and we're wrong, and that theory was not actually a valid theory? So, let's dive in with the historical data, or where are we and how did we get here? I think unfortunately, we did not get the most recent PowerPoint up and running. This was supposed to have a graph of Oklahoma's labor force participation rate going back through the early 2000s. So I guess I'll just have to describe it to you. It is mainly a line going down with sharp dips following the Great Recession that we never entirely recovered from, and another sharp dip following the COVID-19 recession, which we did mostly recover from, then to continue our downward trend. But the overall point that this graph was supposed to make was that this is a long-term problem, and the solutions we're going to talk about today should recognize the realities of the COVID-19 pandemic while also seeking to address the long-term decline that we have been observing for decades in our labor force participation rate. In short, we don't want to just get people back to work to where we were before the pandemic. We want to get even more people back to work. So, to discuss the immediate impacts of the COVID recession, as I'm sure you've all heard multiple times, there were particular demographics that were especially impacted. These demographics being women, particularly women of color, young adults, and adults with low education. And all of these groups are overrepresented in the low-wage workforce, which bore the extreme brunt of the COVID-19 recession. Which is no surprise because the most heavily impacted industries during this recession were industries that primarily pay lower wages, such as leisure and hospitality, health and education services, food services, and transportation. So that's where we were at the beginning of the pandemic. Here's where we are currently. And what this graph shows pretty clearly is that we are seeing a recession of the low-wage workforce. Middle and high-wage income has recovered and then some, but low-wage employment took a much more severe dip, only recovered about halfway, and has been stagnant ever since. And starting in approximately February of this year, has even been declining. So this problem is not getting better on its own. If anything, it is getting worse. Which is curious because if you look at job postings in Oklahoma by education requirements, which I'm going to use here as a proxy variable for the income that they pay, low education jobs are up considerably, an entire 25%. So what this should indicate to us is that the low-wage jobs are there, they're there to be had, but people don't want to work them, which begs the question, why, which is what we'll try to be explaining today. And that brings us to our first theory. The first theory for why people are not going back to work was that the unemployment benefits, which were expanded during the pandemic, were too generous, and it provided a disincentive for people to work, which is backed by a common sense and economic theory. It makes sense that if you pay people to not work, they're going to be more likely to not work. This was also backed up by anecdotal reports in the media as well as some polling of business owners. There's one poll in particular that I'm thinking of that polled over 2,000 small business owners, and approximately 30% of them considered the expanded UI benefits to be inhibiting their ability to hire as many workers as they would like. Now, 30% is not a majority, but it's a sizable enough minority that maybe we should give this theory a solid look into. When examining for academic or empirical evidence, however, there is not much to support this theory. The best we could find was that there was a study done before the pandemic of lottery winners, and what the study was trying to answer was what happens to people's work habits as they get an influx of unearned income, such as through the lottery. And what they found was as unearned income increased, earned income through work decreased, or in other words, they worked less. So if we're going to extrapolate the results of that study to the present situation, it makes a certain kind of sense that as people receive unearned income from the unemployment benefits, they are less likely to pursue earned income through work. However, I would encourage extreme caution when doing this extrapolation because, quite frankly, the situations are very different. There is a massive difference between being presumably financially stable and winning the lottery and getting laid off during the middle of a global pandemic and recession and knowing that you're going to receive supplemental income for a certain amount of time, but you are not quite sure when those are going to run out. So there's tentative proof of concept here with this study, but I would urge extreme caution whenever trying to make a one-to-one mapping of those results. And when you look at the evidence against this theory, it is much more rigorous and much more empirical. There have been multiple studies that examined the impacts that states ending UI benefits early had on employment, and they found that ending benefits had little to no impact on employment. One study estimated that states that did cut benefits early saw approximately 2% of an increase in employment relative to states that didn't, while another study found that that increase was not statistically significant, which means we cannot in good faith attribute it to the unemployment benefits ending. So, to say the least, ending the unemployment benefits was giving us small potatoes, if any potatoes at all. It really did not seem to be much of an impact in our labor market. So, assuming this theory is correct, though, and assuming that there is a disincentive to work from the expanded unemployment benefits, the solution is pretty simple. If the benefits are too generous, you cut the benefits and return them to their previous pre-pandemic levels, which we can cross that off our list. We did it. Oklahoma cut their benefits back in June, and on the federal level, the benefits have expired this September. So, if this theory is correct, then we should be seeing those results any day now. But what if we were wrong? And what if we cut those benefits too early? And I found this quote while doing research for this presentation, and I wanted to include it in full because I think it pretty well encapsulates the problem that we might start to see. Referring to people who are receiving unemployment benefits, these are people that buy groceries and put gas in their car and frequent local businesses. When that money is not there, it's not just going to be the person who's unemployed that is going to suffer. It's going to be the entire community that suffers. And that suffering will likely be borne out in a few key statistics, most prominent of which would likely be food and housing insecurity. Throughout the pandemic, we have seen elevated rates of food and housing insecurity, and if people lose the source of supplemental income from unemployment benefits, but do not find jobs to replace that income, then they will likely have an even harder time making ends meet. And, as this quote would suggest, as their income declines, consumer spending will also decline, which will go on to have ripple effects in their local and state economy. In short, if we got this wrong and we ended the benefits too early, we may have, to a certain degree, shot ourselves in the foot with regard to our economic recovery. So to summarize the information about the unemployment theory, there is little academic evidence in favor, some theoretical evidence. There is strong and compelling academic evidence against. The solution to this theory, if it is correct, we've already done, don't need to worry about it. But if we were wrong, there may be potentially severe economic consequences. And now on to theory two. Theory two is that parents need affordable childcare to re-enter the workforce. Throughout the pandemic, we saw stories of, as daycare centers and schools closed, parents had to scramble while working from home or removing themselves from the labor force entirely to care for their children while their children were home. So, assuming this theory is correct, the solution would be they need childcare or some form of flexibility that allows them to have security in knowing that their children will be cared for while they're returning to work. And the evidence in favor of this theory would be there was a study done midway through the pandemic which found that state policies closing childcare centers caused an increase in unemployment, and that increase in unemployment was both persistent and increasing in magnitude over time. As well as that study, there have been multiple surveys throughout the pandemic from both academic and private sources, such as job hiring firms like Indeed or ZipRecruiter, and they have consistently found that the top two reasons people cite for not having found a job yet are fears of catching or transmitting COVID and a need for childcare. And I want to highlight one of these surveys in particular because I'm going to come back to it in a few slides. It found that 1 in 5 women never want to return to in-person work. This is compared to fewer than 1 in 10 men. Now, what this tentatively suggests to me is that women may be feeling an increased pressure to provide childcare or care for other loved ones. And in order to do that while maintaining full-time employment, something has to give. They need flexibility from their employer, which means that if we want to get them back to work, we likely need to ensure that that flexibility or that support system is there for them. The evidence against this theory, though, there is rather compelling evidence. There was a study released in June which found that needing to care for a child only caused approximately 0 to 2% of the observed decline in employment. And that 0 to 2% range was depending on how exactly they constructed their model. But still, this study stands in pretty stark contrast to the study I mentioned in the previous slide. All that's to say that while the survey data, whenever we ask people why they don't have jobs, was very consistent, the academic literature surrounding this question is, as of right now, fairly mixed, and we will require more research in order to draw more conclusive conclusions. But assuming this theory is correct, then how do we address it? How do we get people the support that they need? Well, the obvious solution to not being able to access childcare is to make childcare more accessible. And how to improve the childcare industry is a topic that is worthy of its own interim study entirely, so anything I say here will be just an entry-level discussion to this very, very broad topic. But a few suggestions would be to address it from both the demand side of the parents and the supply side of the childcare providers. From the supply side, you want to do things that increase the childcare workforce and increase stability for childcare centers, such as changing our reimbursement mechanism to providers from attendance-based to enrollment-based, which would give them more stability in their revenue streams and help them better budget for both normal times and economic crises, as well as pursuing strategies that increase the childcare workforce. Tentative suggestions would be emergency certifications or basically a lot of the strategies that we've seen done with teachers. Anything that's going to increase their compensation or help them get through college, anything to get them through the door will help us take care of our children so that way our parents can go back to work. And then on the demand side, the solution would be more simple. If we increase subsidies that are available to parents, then we will effectively be decreasing the cost of childcare. In other words, it's a win-win all around.
Ms. Fields, can I get you to pause for a second? We've lost our signal online. I want to make sure online viewers don't miss anything.
You excited for your part of this?
Yeah, I think so. I'm getting there. I'm trying to peak at the right time.
Understandable. Don't want to blow it too early.
Exactly. You don't want me jumping up in the middle of yours and yelling. It's the goddamn minimum wage.
Actually, I would love that. And you don't need to worry about getting fired because you're retiring.
Exactly.
In fact,
yeah.
I'm
So
inviting
worst
you.
that could happen. It turns out tomorrow is my last day. My wife has, 70 employees, I think. And she has one who's decided he's retiring in like 2 years.
Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3.
His answer to everything is yours. I'm a short timer. I don't need to do this. I said, you know what? It's time to look him in the eye and point at him with other people around and say, you are a short timer. Just remember, I've got the calendar. You don't.
Ooh, that's bone chilling.
It is, yeah. I think that if that doesn't shut him up, it can't make him any worse.
Oh yeah.
So it's like, oh, well, maybe he'll grumble to himself and say it to himself, and that's an improvement for, 8 people in the room, all of whom are like, okay, that's what we'll do. I'm a short timer. I don't have to do this. Nobody needs that.
I guess I can kind of empathize. Like my senior year of high school, I kind of clocked out too.
Sure.
But also, don't need to make that everyone else's problem.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, this is a job situation.
It appears we solved our technical difficulties. So with that, Ms. Phillips, you're recognized to continue.
Alrighty, rock and roll. So, to repeat this slide really quickly, what if we are wrong about the theory that parents do need affordable childcare to re-enter the workforce? Well, with regard to the investments in childcare, we will likely directly boost women's employment as the childcare workforce is approximately 95% women. So, any investment there will be an investment in a group that was more heavily impacted by the impacts of the COVID-19 recession. It will also be an investment in our workforce, our children, and state budget, because studies have shown that children who have access to high-quality childcare see better health and developmental outcomes. Additionally, this is a long overdue investment in our families because this will allow them to increase the labor force participation rate in the long run. I mentioned a few slides ago that in the context of the COVID-19 recession, the literature is mixed with regard to how big of an impact a lack of childcare had on our observed employment. However, that is only true within the very narrow confines of the COVID-19 recession. Ample evidence from before the recession If one more mic does this, I'm going to take it as an act of God and just sit down. So, should I start from the flexible working policies? Alrighty, perfect. So, workers with flexible scheduling and work from home policies tend to be happier, more productive, and save money. From the company's perspective, they save money by benefiting off of their increased worker productivity, as well as saving on different overhead costs during work from home. In other words, both of these solutions are, even if they don't address the short-term problem immediately before us, they are long-term investments that would be beneficial to our state, our families, and our workforce. So, to summarize the conversation around the child care theory, there is strong evidence in favor, but compelling evidence against The fix would require an investment in childcare and flexible working practices. And even if we're wrong and this does not get parents back to work in the immediate term, it is still a long-term investment in our workforce productivity and labor force participation. And now on to theory 3. And theory 3 is that people are refraining from returning to work because of fears of catching or contracting COVID or spreading it to their loved ones, which makes common sense. If you or your loved one is immunocompromised, it makes sense that you would want to avoid situations that could potentially put you or their lives in danger. There's also a term in economic theory that can help us kind of understand how this works in the labor market, and that term is friction. And friction in a labor market is essentially anything that increases the amount of time between a worker becoming unemployed and finding a new job. So for instance, a common source of friction would be location. If you were recently unemployed, you would likely want to find a job that is relatively close to you so you don't have to move away from your friends and family. This takes more time than finding literally the first job anywhere, so that's a friction. COVID-19 adds a friction because if you want to return to work, but you want to return to work safely, then you need to find an employer whose values with regard to COVID match your own. This could mean things like, do they require customers to wear masks, or do they require their employees to get vaccinated? Things like that, where it just takes more time to find that right match for you, which means more people will stay out of the labor force for longer periods of time. This is also a theory backed by, like mentioned earlier, the multiple surveys of job seekers who repeatedly reported that they are staying out of the workforce, a prominent reason because of fear of catching COVID. There also is considerable academic evidence to support this claim because studies have found that states with higher vaccination rates are seeing greater employment gains than states with lower vaccination rates. This would indicate that as you make the workforce safer to return to, more people will be interested in returning to work. And the evidence against, there really isn't any. I did not see a single source trying to claim that fear of COVID was not a significant factor in people's decision to return back to work. There is mild uncertainty, as there has not been a lot of Oklahoma-specific polling. So presumably, even if we eradicate COVID tomorrow, there will still be some group of people who do not return to work for a variety of other reasons, including the reasons that they weren't in work before the pandemic. And we just don't know exactly how large that group is in our state. So while it's clear that theory 3 is considerably true for a lot of people, we don't know exactly how large that lot of people is. But the evidence in favor is still very compelling. So since it is pretty clear that, at least for a large group of people, fear of COVID is something keeping them away from work, how do we address that? And I know you've all heard this, 8 ways to Sunday, to death and back, but masks and vaccines. Masks and vaccines are proven strategies to help reduce the spread of COVID in our communities. And if we can reduce that spread, we will make the workforce safer and give more people the security they need to re-enter the workforce. Aside from mitigating the spread of COVID, however, a more creative solution would be to use ARPA funding to fund a paid family and medical leave program. This would give employees not necessarily a safer workforce, but more stability and flexibility as they enter the workforce, which might be a deciding factor for them. For instance, if an employee wanted to go and get vaccinated, they would be able to go get vaccinated, and if they experienced symptoms immediately after the vaccine, they would be able to take a few days off of work knowing that their job and their paychecks will still be secure. Additionally, if the employee should get sick or one of their loved ones get sick, this would give them the flexibility they need to address that situation and care for their loved one or themselves, again, knowing that their job and their paycheck is secure. So while this would not make things safer per se, it might provide some much needed stability for workers who are on that fringe of deciding whether or not to re-enter. And this has the added bonus of we can use the ARPA funding as essentially a test run for a pilot program of this. Other states have adopted paid family and medical leave, and they have seen a variety of benefits that I'll get to in a couple slides. And this would give us a chance to test this out in Oklahoma using an influx of federal funding, and then we could continue this program if we find it to be successful. But what if we're wrong, and what if somehow magically this does not get people back to work? With regard to masks and vaccines, we will have promoted proven public health strategies to reduce the spread of COVID. We will have made our state and our workforce a safer place to live and work in. With regard to the paid leave program, evidence from other states shows that it would improve parental and child health, reduce employee turnover, and boost worker productivity, all while actually benefiting businesses rather than harming them because of the reduced turnover costs, which can be severe depending on the industry, and increased worker productivity. So, similar to with childcare, this seems to be a pretty clear win-win. It is a long-term investment in our state that will make us more resilient to future economic downturns and crises. To summarize that slide is also wrong. We're still on theory 3, which is the fear of COVID. And to summarize the fear of COVID theory, there is strong evidence in favor, none against. If we want to address it, then masks and vaccines and other public health strategies, as well as a paid leave program, are very promising fixes. And even if we are wrong, we still will have improved Oklahomans' health and invested in their workforce and productivity. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Paul Shin.
Before we turn over, will there be any questions? I just had one question.
Yeah.
Ms. Phillips, when you said studies are finding more vaccinated states are seeing higher employment gains, I haven't seen studies like that. Where are you finding that information? Because I look at like Oklahoma, who presumably has a low vaccination rate, but we're, I believe, number 8th in unemployment.
So this is more on average, and also I would caution against using unemployment statistics as opposed to overall employment, because unemployment measures the percentage of the people who are looking for work are actively in work that are not currently in work. So basically, of all the people who want to be working, how many are not working? Whereas the labor force participation rate measures how many people are trying to be working. So if someone gets discouraged and just drops out of the labor force entirely, are not looking for a job, unemployment is not going to capture them. And the studies that I did find on this were on the national level, so comparing lots of states. So while there may be individual outliers, there is a pretty clear trend going on. So it is likely that even if we're doing well right now, we could be doing even better if we decide to promote public health strategies that will reduce the spread of COVID. And if you would like to see those studies, I can send them to you afterwards.
Thank you for that. Will there be any additional questions? You're recognized, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. Sure appreciate all your hard work, and especially with all the technology issues that we've experienced this morning. Had a quick question concerning one of your comments concerning our child care facilities in the state of Oklahoma and those issues that we're facing with child care. Have you seen any studies or have you done any studies concerning what percentage of the child care facilities in the state of Oklahoma since the pandemic, say March 2020, have closed their doors either permanently or temporarily?
We have not done any studies on that subject. I know personally that there was a large number, at least initially, and I do not know if that situation has gotten better. However, a presenter later on in the study is an expert on the child care field, so they would likely be able to answer that question.
Thank you.
I'm sorry if.
Approximately 20% of facilities closed during the pandemic, and about 5% of them have not reopened.
Follow-ups.
Follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that information. I'm curious to know is possibly if, speaking of incentivizing things, if that may be playing into what we're facing right now, because those folks that run those care facilities may not be willing to come back to work just because of the ability they have right now to pay their bills. That's my question, is just curious about that.
Well, even before the pandemic, we've had a shortage of childcare just slots available. I believe over half of Oklahomans live in what is considered a childcare desert, where there's just not enough childcare slots to meet the demand. So I would say, yes, that is probably a pressing problem that has only gotten worse during the pandemic.
Follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Final follow-up. So coming out of the field of education myself as a career educator, actually driving a school bus and taking kids to the after-school program, which facilitates taking care of children after hours for parents. And schools being closed for, I know one in particular in the state of Oklahoma was closed for some 350 plus days. I'm sure played into this, where we're at right now. So I think that we keep the schools open. And of course, I don't want to chase a rabbit in a hole, but that's just something I'm thinking because of me being out in that field myself and how we can help going forward. Thank you.
Was there a question in there, or?
But sure. So what do you think?
Well, I think yes. I think schools being closed definitely put additional strain on parents. And I think that means it is all the more imperative to reopen schools safely. Because if we can do it safely in ways that are still going to reduce the spread of COVID-19, then we can essentially have our cake and eat it too. We can get children back into schools and we can get parents back into work. But if getting children back into schools means an increased spread of COVID-19, then that might be counterproductive, as the fear of COVID-19 is, like we've mentioned, a considerable thing keeping people out of the workforce.
Senator Brooks, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so I was reviewing the impacted industries, and so a lot of these industries, it seems like, are industries that require someone physically to be present at their job. And so kind of the work from home options don't seem to really fit, when it comes to perhaps healthcare, hospitality, food service, some of these other things. And so other than perhaps the lack of childcare, are there other things that for these service industry jobs that we could do to be able to make them more attractive?
Well, I think for those jobs that cannot be work from home, I think childcare is all the more important then, because they do not have that flexibility to work from home. So I would agree that yes, the flexible working policies are only applicable to certain jobs. This should not be considered a one-size-fits-all solution. It could, however, be one tool of many in our policy reaction.
Follow up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so as far as the minimum wage, because a lot of these jobs perhaps also have to do with, are at least on the entry level, are minimum wage jobs or something close to that. And so do you think that has any impact on it?
So if you wait just a few minutes, my colleague Paul Shin will be going into that in a few slides. But thank you for the question.
I have one last question on this. Do you think we're getting to an argument, too, of maybe year-round public schools and the benefits from that, not just from gap learning, but also for allowing a place for kids, and then with food insecurities, making sure they're fed properly? What were your thoughts on that?
I did not hear the beginning of that question. Could you repeat it, please?
Possibly moving to year-round public schools?
I have not looked into that potential solution. I would have to research more and then get back to you on it.
Thank you for that. You're recognized to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a continuation of our my arduous introductions from the beginning, but we're very honored to be joined by Paul Shin, who's the Budget and Tax Senior Policy Analyst with OK Policy. Mr. Shin, you're recognized.
Thank you, Senator Hicks. Let's move on to the final theory that we want to look at today. This theory is that there is a mismatch in what employers and employees expect from work, and that the expectations have changed over time and apparently have changed dramatically during the pandemic. So we're calling this low-quality jobs because Josie's demonstrated that there are fewer Oklahomans getting into the workforce, and there are fewer low-wage, low-paid jobs getting filled in spite of the huge number of, just the mismatch of the number of openings and the number of applicants is really is very troubling. There's both general and kind of specific things that appear to be going on here. In general, there is a long trend. Josie's graph would have looked like kind of this, as far as how many Oklahomans are in the labor force, and there is clearly a lot going on there, but the pandemic has really accelerated that. And as Josie described, we aren't coming back from that very quickly. An interesting and to me troubling statistic, Oklahoma specific, is that last week new unemployment claims were up for the second week in a row. Overall, the unemployment insurance claims are dropping. People are getting back to work. But then some people who have either been working or just gotten back to work for largely employer-driven reasons, they're out of work. Josie also demonstrated the issue is at the low end of the spectrum for the most part. And here's just 3 national examples that kind of confirm that theory. In July, nationally, 1 out of 17 workers in the restaurant industry quit their job in 1 month. I'm not great at math, but I think that means in 17 months we're out of people who will work in restaurants. 1 out of 25 retail workers quit their jobs, 4% in January. Childcare, I'm going to largely leave to Josie and to Ms. Kuse, but nationally there are 126,000 people fewer working in childcare than there were a year and a half ago. That's probably, if our numbers are in sync with the national one, that probably means that there are over 1,000 less people working in childcare today than there were last March. There's also some specific subparts of the workforce issues here that are giving us concerns. Women who work in businesses, in corporations, 1 out of 4 are now considering either downshifting their career or quitting their jobs. Nearly 3 in 5 women say they're leaving their employers in 2 years or less because of work-life balance issues. Nationally, people with the color of hair that I have and the age that I am are retiring at speeds that are really, really accelerated, even more so than in the last recession. The last year, the number of people who retired is 2 million more than would be expected in a normal year. And that's considering that, we're the baby boomers. There's a lot of us who were retiring anyway, but 2 million more. The New York Federal Reserve Branch does a survey every couple years about people in their 50s. When do they expect to retire? The number of people who expect to retire before age 62 is 5 percentage points higher than it was just a couple of surveys ago. This is really an issue for Oklahoma because we trend a little higher in age than the national average. And of course, the people, who have 30, 40, 50 years working in the workforce, they tend to be highly skilled and thus hard to replace. They also tend to be reasonably wealthy, and we certainly don't want to lose that wealth or lose their contributions to the economy. There seem also to be issues at the other end of the age spectrum. Younger people, particularly the well-educated ones, have significantly different expectations of employment now. They expect flexibility, ability to work at home, flexible hours, things like that. And those well-educated young people, they're the people who are going to be sitting in this room in a couple of decades or a decade making these decisions. And it's really important that employers figure out a way to make things work for those folks. There's some reasons that this theory might be true. You probably know that in Oklahoma, the restaurant sector is doing pretty well. I'm glad I don't own a restaurant. I think it's still brutal right now, but it's less brutal than it is in places like New York and California. The second factor is expectations change. I can say now I'm not going to retire. I'm going to retire when I'm 61. A little late for me, but a hypothetical person could say, yeah, when I hit 62, I'm taking Social Security and I'm out of here. If that's a couple years from now, the calculations might look different to me when I'm actually 62. Another thing that's going, and then the same thing for those younger people with well-educated younger people, they've probably got student loans. Things look different when those loan payments start piling up. You may not be quite as concerned about that ability to work at home. Another thing that's going on is federal assistance and state assistance in the pandemic allowed a lot of people to save money. And the pandemic also prevented us from spending money in a lot of ways. It was pretty hard to buy a car. It was impossible to go on a cruise to the Mediterranean. And so our savings rate, I haven't found great local or national or state data, but our savings rate is probably quite a bit higher than it was a couple of years ago. What happens to savings if you're a good American? You eventually spend it down. And that's going to change what people are willing to do on the job. What can we do about this? One is, and this is not maybe specific to these issues, but the pandemic did reveal that our unemployment system is broken as far as gig workers. These jobs are particularly subject to the whims of COVID. And changing consumer demand. You can lose a job pretty quickly just because of the dynamics of delivering dinner or renting out your spare bedroom. People who are depending on that, for a lot, it's a major source of income, maybe the only source of income. If they lose that job because of lack of demand or changing consumer tastes, they have nothing to fall back on. They need unemployment insurance just like you and I have for the same reason, for that month or two or three while we're figuring it out, finding the right job, making sure we can stay fed and housed. We also need to look very hard, and I know, and I'll say this legislature and executive branch are doing a great job of being very thoughtful about how to use the American Rescue Plan Act money. And I'm sure I won't be the only one to suggest we need to use that hazard pay option the best we can, both as a token of our appreciation for people who worked in grocery stores and Amazon warehouses and places where they put themselves and their families at risk. And we may also need to continue hazard pay as long as we can under the federal rules to help bring people back to the kind of jobs that Senator Brooks is talking about. Speaking of which, we need to think seriously about the minimum wage. It's been 12 years since the state minimum wage has been increased because we leave that in the hands of Congress. It's lost more than a fifth of its value. That $7.25 in 2009 dollars is about $6 now. You just can't live on the equivalent of $6 an hour. And it's hard to say we value work without valuing workers. And it's time for us to have a serious discussion about whether we're going to value workers or not. Finally, we should be looking at job training. One thing we know for sure is the job market and the economy of 2023 isn't going to be the job market and the economy of 2019. Things change. One of the members mentioned healthcare. That's an area where we're losing people like crazy for pretty obvious reasons. We were undernursed and under-PA'd and under-nurse practitioners going into the pandemic. Now we have got to build the kind of workforce that we need to keep Oklahomans healthy, particularly as we continue to grow older. So the state needs to help design and support a job training program that is very targeted to what our needs are, healthcare, automation, things like that. We need to help people in the petroleum industry find high-paying energy sector jobs that are out there. We just need to do some quick training. What if we're wrong? Well, the minimum wage could hasten automation and it could cost some jobs. Automation is going to happen anyway. It's really a matter of timing and whether we're prepared for it or not. But there are studies on the minimum wage that suggest it costs jobs. Even the worst case of those indicate, and that's the recent GAO study or Congressional Research Studies that say for every person that loses a job under the minimum wage, 9 people see a pay raise. Generally, if you can help 90% of Oklahomans in any class, you do that. And that's the opportunity we have with minimum wage. Job training programs are not perfect. There's the history is littered with 4 or 5 decades of state-sponsored job training programs that haven't worked. However, they've tended to be reactive. The steel plant's closing down. We got to make them into something. And they've also not been very targeted. Oklahoma has the infrastructure for superb job training programs, and I wouldn't worry about that much here. So the evidence is mixed, but I think it's pretty safe to say that one thing that's going on here is the mismatch between what employers want and what employees want. Some of that is short term. But the pandemic has really, put the gas pedal on a lot of things that have been happening over the last decade or two anyway. Change is inevitable. So no theory explains what's going on here. Every one of us has heard somebody say that that at least one of those theories is right. No matter what research says. There are some other things we haven't talked about today that you and I have both heard as reasons for people not getting back to work. Labor markets are like every market. Eventually, they adjust. The labor market in the future is going to be different. And we, as Josie said in the introduction, we need to plan for both the short and the long term. There are some policies that are sure winners no matter what. One is providing childcare so that every parent who wants to work has quality, affordable, accessible childcare that matches the hours of the jobs that are being offered, and that allows the owner of that childcare center or home to make a profit and allows the workers to live above the poverty level. We can't go wrong doing that. Paid leave helps workers. It takes it from where we don't take your loss of a job or your serious illness and double down on, your loss of a family member or a serious illness to you or a family member. Paid leave keeps us from doubling down as a society and saying, oh, you're losing your job too. And there are many ways that can be structured affordably and in ways that help businesses as well as individuals. Let's be honest. It's been 100 years since our economy faced something like this. We really don't know how it will come out. The pandemic's been transformative, and we're in a position where we now have resources and increasing knowledge to where we can learn what we can learn from that transformation and come out of it with a state with a stronger economy and a better workforce and more successful business. Mr. Chairman, committee members, we thank you for your time in this, that may be the most important topic that we have to wrestle with for the next months. Senator Hicks, thank you so much for putting this
thank you for that presentation.
Together.
Will there be any questions? Senator Stevens, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So much appreciate you coming to make this presentation, Mr. Shin. You mentioned 100 years ago what we face today. The things I've heard today so far is making me go back actually in my mind and what it looked like 100 years ago. Being a 60-year-old legislator now, I find myself thinking about a lot of different things. But to the point, one of the statistics I heard today is 1 in 5 women are looking at not re-entering the workforce. Now, you made a presentation and threw a statistic out there and helped me with that. You said 3 in 5 or 2.5 out of 5. What was that statistic?
3 out of 5 in a survey women who work in corporations said they would quit in 2 years.
Okay. Thank you very much for that information. So it makes me go in a place in my mind to go back in time, being a school counselor of 25 years, working with families and students individually, trying to make a difference and leave a legacy, for what I stood for. And that's why I'm sitting here before you today as a senator. I look back 100 years ago and those ladies that took care of our kids and raised them up in the way they should go. I wonder how many care facilities we had back in those days for our children.
Child care facilities?
Yes, sir.
I don't think we know that, and Ms. Kuse may have kind of a better take on this. My take on it, first of all, I'm glad you aren't 100. I thought that's where you were going, and let me say, you look great. Second, child care was a lot more informal. Before, say, the 70s. The parents probably had a parent living with them who could provide the child care. Neighbors provided child care. There's still a lot of that we don't know about because in Oklahoma, we don't license those kind of informal things. There is no doubt that there are more women proportionally in the workforce now than there have been, for most of the last 100 years. Part of that is because it's increasingly difficult to raise a family on one income.
Quick follow-up.
Just to be perfectly clear where I stand on ladies, I've worked with many of them over the years, and I have a special place in my heart for them. So by no uncertain terms am I suggesting they don't have a place in the workforce, because they do, and I so much appreciate them. I thought it would just help the conversation. I'm the guy that wants to look at everything from every single angle, and this is why I appreciate this interim study, Senator Hicks, so very much. I do have one final question, if it would please the chairman.
Just please get to the point, because we're running short on time.
Yes, sir. So I just had a question that I haven't heard anything from the medical marijuana field, that industry being brought up today. And so I'm just questioning whether or not that has a bearing on where our workforce has actually went to, because I think everybody is pretty knowledgeable that that is a cash industry. And if if the labor is being paid in cash, then there's no way to track that. I just have a concern about that, and I just wonder if there is a study that's been done by the state of Oklahoma or any other state, for that matter, that has addressed this.
Not to my knowledge. It is a great question.
I have one question. When I've done my research in the past, when it comes to minimum wage, it looks that the average nationally is 2% or so of the workforce actually earns minimum wage. This weekend, I actually saw a fast food place that had $14 an hour to try to hire. Being a father of 4, 3 of them that are teenagers that have just recently worked, I can assure you they're great kids, but they don't deserve more than minimum wage. Do you have any fears if we were to raise, since there's not that large of a population that actually earns a minimum wage, and then you couple it with teenagers trying to enter the workforce to gain work ethic and work experience, would we do them an injustice?
It's important to remember that a lot of minimum wage workers, I can't remember the statistic, and I really should, are over 25. It's not just the teenagers, and I don't believe the teenagers are the majority.
I agree with that point, but the statistics of 2%, maybe less than 2%, actually earn minimum wage.
Right. Clearly times change, statistics change. In 2018, it was 250,000 Oklahomans who worked for minimum wage. So that's a pretty good sized amount. And clearly, there are restaurants still paying minimum wage, absolutely. There are also a lot paying $12, $13, $14. The question we need to ask ourselves is, does that last? And what happens to workers who are being paid $14 an hour if wages start dropping again?
So the statistic you said was 250,000?
Yeah, 250,000.
Out of 1.8 million?
Probably about a couple of million working Oklahomans.
And where did the statistic come from?
I believe census. I'll get you the report on that.
I appreciate that because that goes counterintuitive to everything I've seen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Any additional questions? Senator Hicks, you're recognized to present your next speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much to our first two presenters. We're going to move into our next presenter, Director Paula Kuse. She's the Executive Director of Oklahoma Child Care Resource and Referral Agency, and she has been serving in this capacity since September of 2008. And unfortunately, she's already announced her retirement for this June, and it will be a significant loss, not only to her specific agency, but to Oklahomans. Ms. Kuse, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning. As Senator Hicks said, I'm the Executive Director of the Oklahoma Child Care Resource and Referral Agency. We provide free assistance to parents seeking child care. We give them information on what to observe when they visit a child care facility, what kinds of questions to ask, and how to apply for subsidy assistance. We also provide training and technical assistance to providers, and we compile data on child care in the state of Oklahoma. So in your packet, you have a sheet from our portfolio that has statistics for the entire state, and then I gave you a copy of the Oklahoma County statistics, but you can go to our website, okportfolio.org, okchildcareportfolio.org, or you can go to the OKRA website, which is oklahomachildcare.org, and there's a link to the portfolio, and you can look up any county in the state. So you can look at the specific counties that you serve in the portfolio data. So we have referral specialists who take calls from parents to help them find child care, and they often shudder when they receive calls from some counties in Oklahoma. We have many, many, many child care deserts in the state of Oklahoma. As an example, in Cimarron County in the Panhandle, there are no child care facilities, while in Beaver, there are just 3 child care homes with 21 slots, and in Texas County, they have 20 facilities with space for 291 children. It's estimated that in these 3 counties in the Panhandle, there are 2,500 children ages 0 to 5. Of these children, approximately 1,565 have working parents. There are just 312 licensed child care slots in these 3 counties. This accommodates just 1 in 5 children ages 1 to 5. Now imagine that your job was on the swing shift and you had no family in the area to help you. Even counties like Oklahoma and Tulsa have shortages. Space may be available, but not at a facility near your home or your workplace, and again, non-traditional schedules are difficult to accommodate. Half of American families live in a child care desert, where there are at least 3 children for every licensed child care slot. Even when care is available, it is often unaffordable. The average cost of center-based care for infants in the state of Oklahoma is $150.09 a week, and home-based care averages $121.20 a week. What has happened in child care facilities during the pandemic? Some facilities were closed for a period of time. Some of them did not reopen and remain permanently closed. Facilities have struggled to provide care. Enrollment was down, making it more difficult to finance operations, with fixed costs remaining the same but income reduced. Facilities often had to close their entire facility or a single classroom because of COVID protocols during the pandemic. Employees exposed to COVID could not come back to work until they had been in quarantine for the appropriate length of time. Remember that most child care workers in Oklahoma earned $21,480 in 2019. In addition, most child care workers have neither paid leave nor health insurance. For some, unemployment compensation was a more stable income during the pandemic. Ready Nation states that access to quality care is key to women returning to work, especially in the hospitality and tourism industries, which boast a significant female labor force. Lack of childcare was an important driver of women exiting the workforce as both schools and childcare providers closed and many mothers left work to care for their children. Early in the pandemic, women were 4 times more likely than men to indicate that caring for children kept them from working as both schools and child care providers were closed. In December of 2020, lack of child care was the 3rd most reported reason for unemployment, being laid off, or having one employers experience a reduction in business. OKDHS has used federal relief funds to support child care. Co-pays for child care subsidy have been waived since summer of 2019 and will continue to be waived until at least April of 2022. Child care providers have received an extra $5 per day per child in subsidy payment. They have not had to collect co-pays from their parents, and they have received sustainability grants. And yet, this is still not enough to help an industry that was already struggling before the pandemic began. Like every employer that pays $10 or less an hour, child care facilities are struggling to hire classroom teachers. They find it difficult to keep them on staff, and they have difficulty onboarding staff. Fingerprint and background checks that can take 4 weeks or longer prevent an employee from being hired in a timely manner. They can't wait for a paycheck and move on to other employment. Providers find it necessary to limit the children they serve, not because they don't have space, but because they don't have teachers. Looking for care during non-traditional hours, meaning 7 a.m. or after 6 p.m., good luck. 29% of requests for assistance finding childcare was for non-traditional schedules. 30% of these requests were for evening care, 14% were for 24-hour care, and 22% were for overnight or weekends. But just 11% of the providers in our database offer one or more types of non-traditional care. Our economy hinges on making childcare more accessible and affordable for families of young children. In 2012, Oklahoma Child Care Resource and Referral completed the Oklahoma Economic Impact Study of Child Care, which is now 9 years old. The study noted that the link between child care availability and the state's workforce has implications for overall state economic growth. Economic research generally confirmed that child care subsidies increase the likelihood that low-income workers will choose to enter the labor force. Many low-skilled workers will opt to participate in the labor force if assistance is available to offset the financial burden of child care costs. If you want women back in the workforce, there have to be quality child care options available for their children. If you want a stable child care industry, every effort must be made to support a living wage with benefits for child care employees, and child care facilities must have the ability to sustain their business from their income. I want to just very quickly, when Paul was speaking, he said we don't track informal care. And I want to make you all aware that Oklahoma has some of the most stringent licensing regulations in the entire country. If you take care of even one child who is not related to you, you must be licensed unless you're caring for that child in their own home. And you must be licensed if you care for children for more than 20 hours a week in rural settings or 15 hours a week in the metropolitan areas. So we have a very robust regulation system in the state of Oklahoma that helps us to make sure that children are in safe environments. We don't know how much off the book childcare there is because there's no way to track it. They're not licensed. So there may be a lot of informal care out there. We simply are not made aware of it. So I also provided you with some information from the Bipartisan Policy Center about funding child care in the state and the child statistics for the state of Oklahoma. So does anybody have any questions?
Will there be any questions of the speaker? Seeing no questions, Senator Hicks, you're welcome to introduce your next speaker.
Thank you so much, Director Kuse. Really appreciate the information that you shared with us. Our next speaker is Joanne from Oklahoma City Black Chamber, and she is very good at maintaining her privacy, as it was difficult for us to find any information about her education online. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Senator Hicks, and thank you all in attendance. My name again is Joanne Davis. I'm currently serving as the Executive Director for the Oklahoma City Black Chamber of Commerce, where we help facilitate the creation, development, sustainment, and maintainment of Black, minority, and woman-owned businesses. Giving you a little history, I'm also a retiree from Tinker Air Force Base, having served there for over 35 years, and 8 years of that career as the Small Business Director for Tinker, Robbins, and Hill Air Force Base. I have a passion for small businesses and have spent a majority of my career dealing with them, so this is just what I love to do. So saying all of that, I'll begin by saying that some of the issues I note will be common to all small businesses, inclusive of any ethnicity, and will also be shared with those small businesses in our rural communities. At the top, COVID got us here. The impact will be felt for years to come, unfortunately, for small businesses who are the engines of our economy. Many will not recover because of their inability to hire and keep employees. And I say all of that to say, I don't care across the country, statistics will pan this out. When our small businesses fail, our economy fails. Many of Black and minority small businesses, as they do for capital, rely on their family as their employee pipeline. This is really seen in those businesses in the service industry. And where we've heard a lot of statistics, what you'll hear from me has to do with me walking through the doors of many small businesses up and down 23rd throughout our community, speaking to them one-on-one. Even when and if the business is passed from the first generation to the second, chances are the first generation is still working in the business. But with COVID, many of those businesses would not allow their previous generation to work for fear they were going to be exposed to COVID and subsequently die. For those businesses in the service industries that I've spoken about, fear of this virus has prevented many of them and their employees from returning and has pushed them to find work in other industries that do not require in-person work, which your statistics have bared out. Applicant pool is low. There are a variety of reasons. Some of it has to do with competitive wages, as you've talked about. Many of our major service industry, McDonald's, Burger King, have increased their hourly rate. If a small business cannot afford to pay from $15 to $18 and offer benefits like sick leave, insurance, and alternate work schedules, and not to mention the ability to work virtual, the pool of applicants are small. The higher wage opportunities and benefits may not be a choice a small business owner can make now, particularly as they emerge from COVID. The cost of child care, which you have talked about very well, is a reason that many women have not returned to work. About 10 years ago in this very building, I attended a women's conference, and during that session, it was stated that a woman, and this is 10 years ago, a woman with one child, single woman with one child, to live in a reasonably safe environment or apartment, own a used car with one child, and pay for child care, they would need to make $18 an hour. That was 10 years ago. Now, using that example, even if the job was there, even with benefits, $18 an hour is not enough today when you add child care. Conversely, small and minority businesses cannot compete with the wage and benefits for the qualified and quality employees they need to run effective businesses. Black business owners have said the inconsistency associated with their employees is killing them. They hire a qualified and quality worker with children in school. Child gets exposed. The worker must take off, go home, and be quarantined with their child in accordance with the rules of the school. If this happens repetitively, the business owner loses patience as well as they should. Worker gets discouraged and doesn't come back to work. Geographic locations and transportation makes a difference. While this city has moved greatly in the area of transportation, we still do not have adequate transportation from the north side of town to the south side of town, from Midwest City to the north side of town, etc. Many small businesses have tried to accommodate all of the things that they have to by shortening their business hours, changing their menus, because as you all know, if anybody goes to the grocery store, and here we have, our prices have gone up. You try to buy some steak, and let me just say, no, I'm going to say hamburger meat. You try to buy hamburger meat, it has almost doubled in cost. So borrowing money to expand outside eating, many have done that and tried with grants to accommodate that, change their technology, improve it, use of grants and the funds that we've received from the federal government. All are done to bring more customers into the business, but that's a slippery slope when you don't have employees. So, having said that, and I've discussed with many members of the chamber, they want to know what mechanisms, because like a lot of us here has been pointed out, that we thought the unemployment is what's keeping unemployment benefits are keeping them at home. And I've had some deep conversations with many of them to say that's not necessarily the case, but however, that's what they believe. And so in discussing that, what they've asked me to do is to share with you, they want to know what is the process for receiving unemployment. How are we keeping the people, and I'm only bringing to you what they brought to me, how are we keeping the people who are on unemployment accountable for what they have to do to find these jobs? Now, this is what I'm asking because that's what they asked me to bring to you. So part of this is an education process that perhaps we need to have something out there with small business owners to let them know what that process is. And then conversely, how you can make those individuals. I personally, and what I have seen statistically, it's really not many people trying to scam the system. It's a multifaceted issue with multifaceted solutions. It is a problem that you can't just point one arrow at and expect for it to fall. It's just not going to happen. So, but I have this venue to tell you that that's what these small businesses are asking. I can only say that the more emphasis needs to be placed on job availability, connecting people without jobs with jobs. I'm here to tell you that when you talk about child care, which is a huge issue for the employee and the business owner, one of the people I know that's a small minority-owned business, she created a business called Recess OKC. And what it is a shared co-working space that has child care. So if you are working at home, but you don't know, you can't control everything at home, then you can come to this co-working space and she has child care available. But even she suffered because her workers got sick and she was in a pinch because of that. So, you know, COVID is what got us here. Some kind of way we got to really address this issue. And I'm not here on a political thing. I'm just saying, y'all, it is what it is. And we have to address it because it really has tentacles that reach far beyond some of the things that we can't see. But if we don't solve this problem with our small businesses, our economy is going to suffer, and not just today, but for years to come for us to recover. And that's it. You have any questions?
Thank you for that presentation. Will there be any questions? Senator Hicks, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you so much. I am interested in your final comment about the Recess OKC and the shared workspace. One of many proposals that we've seen from other states is somewhat of a Main Street co-op that I feel like might be beneficial in rural Oklahoma in kind of sharing some of the cost and responsibility of providing safe childcare for their employees. Do you mind expanding upon that particular business model and what we might be able to do on a broader scale to incentivize more opportunities like that?
Well, I think the shared workspace is all over the city. I know that Star Space, I believe, is one, but they don't offer childcare. She's the only one. Her name is Paige Mitchell, and she's the only one that I know of that has this model. And I'd be more than happy to provide the information regarding that. But it was an idea, and she'll tell you she created this idea and went forth, as most small businesses do, on a dream, and realized, particularly as COVID happened, what she could do to help other single mothers like herself.
Will there be any additional questions? You recognize Senator Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today and all that you've presented to us this morning. So I made a note, actually, before you brought this up to our attention about the accountability, I had made a note in my notes to follow up on that. Being a freshman legislator, that's one of the things that I've heard out there to make sure that our folks that are unemployed, making sure they're legitimately looking for another job. So I appreciate that, and I will be following up on that as well. Thank you for.
Yeah. Now
yes.
let me put a note on that. Don't make it the responsibility of the business owner, because most of our small business owners, I will tell you, they're so busy doing the business that they don't have the time to do anything else but. So when you look at the accountability, it has to be in a manner in which it doesn't impact the small business, that the onus is on them. Okay.
Ms. Davis, I agree with you 100%.
Noted. Thank you.
One of the things I'm hearing throughout these conversations was with child care is some of the regulations we have in place. And I know it's a very fine line on how we keep our children safe, but don't put up such barriers and regulations that we can't have these different forms of child care. And that's something, Senator, I'd be interested in looking at in this next session. Do you have any more speakers? You're recognized to introduce your next speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for your flexibility in modifying our agenda so that our final presenter had a previous commitment. But we are so excited to be able to welcome Drew Dugan from Oklahoma City Chamber. He is the vice president, and his background in education is that he received his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Communications from OU in 1991 and his Master's of Public Policy from the University of Chicago, Harris School of Public Policy in 1998. And so I'm very excited for him to join us today to provide additional perspective from the business community about the challenges that they're experiencing currently. Thank you, Mr. Dugan.
There we go. Can you hear me that good? Okay. Thank you, Senator Hicks. Thank you, Chairman. Sorry I couldn't be here earlier for the whole proceedings. I did have another engagement. I'll try and get straight to the point. I haven't heard what everybody else said, but my presentation is really kind of give you some perspective from the Oklahoma City Chamber, really on the big picture numbers. Probably the most interesting piece is some of the data we've got directly from our members. Just to cut straight to the chase, the three main takeaways I'll tell you right now is that the labor market, at least, and also I'll preface this, most of my numbers are about Oklahoma City only. I don't claim I'm the Greater Oklahoma City Chamber. We're pretty significant, but we're by no stretch of the imagination the whole state. But the main takeaways I'd leave you with, and I'll just start with those, is that thus far we're almost back to full employment already. In Oklahoma City, we are at 97% of employment from where we were in 2019. Unemployment is under 3%. Well, It's gone up actually a little bit since June, but we're essentially back to where we prefer in 2019, which is full employment, which is a challenge. The reason that one of the other big takeaway is that the mismatches between labor supply and labor demand continue to be in place, and those differences are historic. They've been developing for a long time. They've continued to develop over the last couple of years, and I think going forward is the bigger picture. How do we match those labor supply, labor demand things are the bigger questions, not just the concerns that we faced over the last couple of years. And then the last thing is that businesses, everybody thinks that every business is open and back to exactly where they were. They are not. They are still trying to figure out how they handle, as the previous speaker mentioned, childcare, school, whether or not they're one of the biggest concerns for our members are they working in person? Are they able to retain workers that may not want to be in the office? So those are the big takeaways. I'll dive into some of the numbers real quick. I'm sorry I don't have handouts. I can get those to you later, Senator. If you guys want some of these in writing, I can get you those. So just some of the quick numbers. In Oklahoma City in July 2019, the total employment was about 653,000. People employed in Oklahoma City. As of July 2021, it's 633,000. So we're only 20,000 people down from where we were. Just to put that in perspective, in less than 2 months in 2019, we lost 70,000 jobs in that short period. So over the last 2-year period, we've gained almost all of those back. Now, some of those are going to be in a little bit different industries, a little bit different changes. So those are the big numbers. One thing that is interesting, and this is still kind of an unclear science based on some of our most recent data, looking at the data based on job postings on the internet, there's about 60,000 vacant jobs that people can't fill. Now, there's no perfect scientific way to say that's all the jobs, but based on the internet, which is where a lot of the jobs are, there's 60,000 in Oklahoma City that are out there that are posted, and that's been consistent. So in terms of some of the numbers of what industries are doing well, I'll just tell you, I'll just go through these pretty quickly. Manufacturing is fully employed. It's 101% of what it was in 2019. So there's an additional 400 jobs there. In trade, transportation, utilities, it's at 101%. It's up 1,200 jobs from where it was 2 years ago. Education and health services, as you may or may not know, it's at 100%, and it's up by 400 jobs as well. This one is one that's kind of hard to put your hands around because we've all heard the challenges. Leisure and hospitality are back at 100% already. Now, we have all heard the stories of restaurants and hotels all being short. Some of that is kind of a mismatch between the types of jobs and what jobs were there. But according to the data, we're at 100%, are back to where they were. And that's in leisure and hospitality in central Oklahoma, that's 73,000 jobs. And that's significant. Now, I will say, there was another recent study that said Oklahoma City's the most likely to rebound restaurant jobs based on a national study. Our friends at the Restaurant Association and the Hotel Association say that's not true. So there is a mismatch between data and reality sometimes. I don't know how many economists are here. Sometimes economists aren't always right, but the numbers can be a little confusing. But the number in hospitality, there are a lot of people that were employed there that continue to be employed. We may still need some jobs in different levels to do that. Some of the ones that are pretty much the same, construction's at 99%. They're still looking at about needing 400 jobs. Business and professional services, which is usually engineers, architects, people that do kind of service industries. As you can imagine, some of those are down. It's 94% of where they were. A lot of people have put things on hold. They're not moving forward. So some of those contracts and stuff aren't being done. Other services, which is kind of just different service jobs, they're at 99%. Government, it's down 92%. That's across the board. So they're down 10,000 jobs, still looking to fill some of those jobs. So I know a lot of government workers have left and decided to go somewhere else. But there are some government jobs out there. Some of the ones that are really struggling to retire that probably some may have nothing to do with COVID. Mining, which is oil and gas. They're down 58%, 6,100 jobs. I think we all saw back before 2019 that those jobs weren't going to be as prevalent anyway, but that shows up. And then one that we're really not clear exactly how it is, information services, which is a big industry, they're down 80%. Some of that I think you may see in some of these other numbers. So I think that's a pretty clear, maybe not clear, but it's a pretty broad perspective that I think backs up the point that most people, most industries are getting back to full employment if they're not already there. Now let me go through some of our, I mentioned some of our surveys, and this is just a survey of the Greater Oklahoma City Chamber membership. It is by no stretch the entire community, but we've surveyed them, all our members. Just so you know, we have about 3,500 members, largest chamber in the state, one of the largest in the country. We think it's not the end all be all, but it helps us understand our business, but I thought might be valuable for you all to understand. And this kind of gets back to how businesses are coming back. Are you working remotely? Are you requiring vaccinations? That sort of stuff. So, how many of your, one of the questions is, do you have employees working remotely now? Some people say everybody's back. Last March, it was, so just this past spring, 61% were working remotely, 40% were in person. As of just this last month, it's only up to 50-50. So only about half the people are still, and this is our companies. A lot of them, are corporate folks, but it's still a lot of companies still have people working remotely. And some of the questions is, has the pandemic changed the way you view remote working? And I'll just kind of go through these pretty quickly. They're all kind of nuanced, and people can answer in multiple ways. We're all coming back, and we'll use remote work in special situations. That's 29%. We're considering leaving some positions remotely permanently. That's 10%. We're going to leave people at remote permanently. We're considering remote work for future workforce needs where we can't find the talent, meaning we're having a hard time getting the right people. And if we need to make it remote, we will. That's up to 6% of our membership. Do you anticipate leaving a large percentage of your people remote? Companies really don't want to do that. That's only about 3% that say they would do that permanently. But as of now, they are still willing to do that because of the challenges. You are concerned that you will lose some of your talent to companies that only have remote workers. That's up to 11% of employers are really concerned about that challenge, that they're going to have a hard time competing if they don't have full-time remote work. So that's a pretty interesting, I think different from what a lot of people think, is that everybody thinks, oh, everybody's going back to work and it's normal. I don't think that's the case. There's still a lot that are staying remote and will continue to do that. Let me just go through some of these other ones on random questions, then I can take questions. Are you willing, so this has to do with vaccinations. Are you planning to require, but instead of requiring them, are you going to incentivize your employees to become vaccinated? 60% said no. 20% said, yes, we're going to go ahead and incentivize. I know several companies are paying cash bonuses as well as some education. And then another 20% are still considering that, waiting to see what happens. Are you mandating vaccines? Just over 68% are not. Only 11% are mandating them. And I think that's kind of what everybody's seeing in the national, and our numbers show the thing. Are staffing challenges impacting your company's ability to operate effectively? 30% say, yes, we are having to operate at less than full capacity of our regular employees. 20% say, we're keeping up, we're doing okay. 40% say staffing is a real problem. And then 10% are kind of some other things. So kind of mixed, but there are more people that are having problems with their business because of low staffing. Has COVID delayed your company's full return? So I'll go back to some of the numbers this past spring. We had about 40% in the spring that said we'll be back by September, and the rest were next. And right now we are at just under 40, just at about 45% have gone ahead and returned. So what that says, a lot of ones that expected to be back are not back yet. They're still kind of waiting, and this was this survey was done several weeks ago, so it may be changing. But I think based on the numbers of Delta we've seen, there's still a lot of companies that are pumping the brakes, kind of waiting to see what happens. I think that's the last big number I really have. We've got, like I said, I can share you some of this. Here's something I think that's kind of interesting. Are you restricting participation of your employees to participate with an outside organization? So are you letting your people go to lunch? Are they able to go to outside meetings? 30% of our members are still saying, we don't want you going to outside meetings. We want you to stay on Zoom. We don't want you to go to big meetings. And that's still, for my business and the chamber business, we do a lot of events. I'm sure you all go to a lot of events, a lot of meetings. It's a big part of our business. So it's a concern. And so a lot of us are still doing that. But still 70% are saying we're not going to do that. And then are you allowing them to go to events outside of work? So our membership's not telling people what to do outside of work, as much as they love to say you've got to go to work and back home. They're not doing that. Once they're away from work, that's kind of where it is. So that's a lot of numbers, but I think that gives you some interesting perspectives. And really, the main takeaways, as I said at the start, is that we're pretty much close to being back at full employment. We do have structural challenges with mismatches of works. And in Oklahoma City, at least, they're still struggling with how we get back to work. They're making progress, but it's going to take a little bit longer. So that's quite a lot of numbers to throw at you, but thank you for having me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I'd say for myself, that was quite eye-opening on the 10% that are going to continue remote working. I really assumed that we'd hit a new plateau and there was going to be more remote workers. So that was very interesting. On the 60,000 jobs that are out there, that's in the...
That are being posted, yeah.
Yes, that's in the greater Oklahoma City area?
Correct.
Do you know roughly what type of jobs those are? They in, I mean, more in salary range?
I'm not sure if I have that here. No, I don't. I could maybe get you some of those and dig into the data a little bit and get back to you. But
I'd be curious to see where those jobs that the 6,000 are being filled were.
Anecdotally, I mean, I've got just kind of the types of jobs here. I don't have salary numbers, but a big portion of those, it looks like, are support staff, entry level, in some skilled positions. So I don't have the numbers, but just anecdotally, it looks like those are kind of more of the lower to middle end skill level.
Gotcha. That's what I was presuming. Well, thank you for that.
But I'll try and dig
That'd be helpful.
some of those
I
numbers.
appreciate that. Will there be any questions? Senator Hicks, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Dugan, for being here. I was wondering if you all have surveyed your members about any of their policies. Obviously, you gave us some numbers about vaccines, but specifically to social distancing or masking, do you have any data on what the businesses are doing to protect their employees?
We did not ask that question in the latest survey, but I'm just going to kind of go off the top of my head. We did ask that back at the start in over the summer and the spring, and it was the numbers were about, I mean, obviously early on they weren't much, but really in the heart of everything in the last summer and last spring, about, I think if I remember, at least 60 to 70% of them had restrictions on what they could do in the office, is the way we asked them. They said, okay, if you're going to be in the office, we're requiring you to stay in your office or have social distancing. Like, for example, even at our chamber offices, even now, we're encouraged to have, like, I've got meetings with people on the 4th floor of our building via Zoom. All of our conference rooms are still social distance. The meeting I was at earlier today that I was late for was with the school district, Oklahoma City Schools. They're still socially distanced. So I'd say most of them are still, and based on the numbers of them still being remote, I think most businesses in Oklahoma City and in a corporate environment are continue to maintain pretty strict continued social distancing rules.
Any additional questions? Seeing none, Senator Hicks, thank you for that. You're recognized for your conclusion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I'm very appreciative to all of our special guests and speakers that were able to join us today and present some compelling information. I know I've been given a lot of questions that I still have answers to, and I think that's the purpose of a good interim study, is to make us think more critically and be more reflective on the things that we think we thought we knew before we started. One of our guests that I wished we would have been able to have today is Chad Wilkerson, who is an economist with the Federal Reserve. He published an article that I'll be sending out to all of the committee members on September 7th entitled, "Where Are All the Workers?" The information is specific to Oklahoma, and it's very, very important information for all of us to understand and recognize. He's unfortunately in a federal blackout period because of the rules congressionally. So he was not able to join us today to share that information in person, but I did want to encourage, all of our committee members, additionally anyone who is interested or watching and listening online, Where Are All the Workers by Chad Wilkerson, published on September 7th. One of the biggest indicators is that Oklahoma has very few people sitting on the sidelines to enter the workforce. And so, as we're looking at ways to incentivize folks to return to the workforce, a large part of that population that is sitting on the sidelines have health challenges. So benefits, including health insurance, paid family leave policies, those are very important for those individuals to consider if they are putting their health at risk in entering the workforce. Additionally, childcare has been a continuing theme throughout this study, but that's another finding that Mr. Wilkerson shares as far as having that discretionary income to be able to invest in your child's well-being while you are maintaining employment. Those margins are pretty slim for most workers in the state of Oklahoma, and so I think it's very important for all of us to consider ways in this legislative body that we can address some of those challenges or encourage our partners in the business community to also be thinking about long-term solutions to making sure that people feel safe, protected, and inspired to work in Oklahoma. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you with that, and that'll conclude our interim study on what is preventing Oklahomans from returning to the workforce after the pandemic. This afternoon, we will have the interim study starting at 1:30 on equitable procurement for minority and women-owned businesses. I have a previous engagement, so Vice Chair Coleman is going to be leading that interim study. With that, we'll be adjourned until 1:30.